Chapter 10. I am sorry, young man, but there is no indication that your friend ate any herb. He's fine, he is as fit as a fiddle, only he is nervous and scared. Maybe he was just having a hard day yesterday, Selnovit told Nethin, pointing to a stunned David who was jigging on the bed like crazy. Surely he didn't eat some herb. Maybe we need to check his condition again, Nethin said. Nope, I've already done 2 studies and both indicate that he didn't eat anything. Besides, if he ate such a herb, his convulsions and foam in his mouth would have appeared a long time ago. Hearing this, David, sitting on the sidelines, twitched in terror. At least he will remember not to touch any unknown plants in this world from today on. He had the impression that when he will return to home, out of habit, he will avoid various plants, even the ones he knows. So what happened to him? He saw something that wasn't there, shouted nonsensical words, even told me to chase myself, Nethin said to the doctor. Was he said to chasing yourself? The old long-bearded doctor was surprised. Yes, he told me to chase myself. I don't know what he was thinking then. HMMMH, it's very interesting. I think that your young friend, as I said, had a tough day or was just making stupid, childish jokes. Is this true, David? Maybe you wanted to avoid today's exercises in this way, said the Lord's servant to the teenager. I didn't make any jokes. I'm telling you the truth with my hand on my heart, in good conscience, replied David nervously. The nonsense you told me was ridiculous. Either you're lying or you have something with your head, Nethin replied. And that's interesting. Every day I hear people talking about some dragons, wild tribes from across the ocean, and your king who has been imprisoned by some monsters, dwarfs, mudmans, some poptolids and mutated big people walk all over the camp. All this does not surprise you, but when I say that there is an inscription on the sword, you tell me that it is not possible. So I understand. Where did I end up? To the world of the Lord of the Rings or to Narnia? I'm starting to be afraid here. What else will I meet here? Aliens? Thumbelina? Goldfish? He spoke like some sleepwalker. David, it's really not funny. It's downright pathetic. What are you even talking about? I don't understand you. The poptolids, the mudmans and the other creatures you see are completely real, and you're telling us about some uncreated things, Nethin said. Chase yourself, you Hazel, yelled David suddenly, but quickly he clogged his mouth. Have you heard, Master? Not only does he say that I should chase myself, but he also named me a Hazel. Nethin turned to Sunvoot. Yes, I heard. It's really strange. The boy just makes stupid jokes. Do not pay attention to them, youthfully man, the cheerful doctor replied. I'm not lying or joking. I'm not stupid. On this sword there is really polish inscription, shouted the boy in bed. Polish? And what is polish? What polished? Is it a color or thing? I don't know of such a word, the doctor asked. Poland. This is my country, and I want to go back there eventually as soon as possible, David shouted rudely. Country? I have never heard of the land of Poland, said the doctor. Suddenly, Nethin took on a strange expression as if he were wondering about something. Hey, you are supposedly from another world, right? Said Lord's servant at last. Yes, idiot. Congratulations that you finally guessed it. I just wonder why you know a lot about my world and I have never seen your planet on the map of the solar system. I am probably in another galaxy trillions of light years from home, David replied. Nethin, however, did not listen to David at all, but after a while he finally dared to ask. In that case, if you are from another world, what is this kind of a Hazel? Animal? Plant? Any character? David couldn't stand it anymore. You are this kind of Hazel. This time, Nethin took on an angry and at the same time surprised expression. And what exactly is it chasing themselves? What does this mean? Why Hazel? Is that an offensive word? Asked Nethin again. David was clogged. He didn't even know what the word meant. All he knew was that the word was not exactly one of the kind ones. Hazel is a man who is hazel color. David burned stupidity because he wanted to answer the question as soon as possible. He clogged his mouth embarrassed, but Nethin was able to believe what he said. After all, there was never a servant of the Lord in David's world. It's a kind of disease. Maybe I'll tell others about this bush of hazel. Maybe they will know something more about this hazel disease that causes them to take on a different skin color. I have to admit, boy, that your world is really mysterious, Selnovit said. When David heard this, he broke down. He got even more and fell limply on a comfortable bed. Put this youngster in another tent. There has to be a place for patients, not for goofballs, the doctor told Nathan. David heard this, so he got up and walked obediently towards the exit. When he was outside, he ran towards the barracks. When he was finally there, he saw a crowd of people who were impatiently waiting for something. They were probably supposed to watch the training. David realized he had to be there, and he must have been late. Suddenly, he heard someone's voice. 2 players have not yet arrived. Trainings will be cancelled if they do not come soon. This voice came from the crowd. David was embarrassed when he showed himself in front of the audience. Everyone began to look at him. David couldn't stand it. He wanted to go underground, but unfortunately it was impossible. He was 10 minutes late because of Nanthornin's mysterious sword and his own stupid behavior. Finally, one of the players has come. Ladies and gentlemen, said a loud voice among the crowd. The boy stepped behind the railing and saw his opponent. He was, of course, Selif. He was a big warrior in leather and iron armor. For this he had an orange belt and black robes. His menacing face was adorned with a long scar. However, his face was handsome, proud and hostile. Short brown hair revealed where small bruises and wounds. David realized that this man was shorter but better built than Nanthornin. David felt like a little mouse with this giant. A cold thrill passed him, even though it was very warm outside. I, like this, are we going to fight to the death? It's not fair, broke down David. Of course we will not shed our blood to the little one. You have to attack me with a sword and I have to defend myself, said Selif's serious voice, which did not quite match his handsome appearance. A weight off from David's mind. Only now did he notice that the enemy did not have a weapon, but David thought that this giant could shock him with just 2 fingers. David, however, came a few steps closer to the giant. He heard a clear voice in his mind. In addition, a strangely familiar voice that said, "Do not lose faith." These quiet, pleasant words made the boy gain some courage. Suddenly, after a while, something reminded him. He remembered a story he had heard several times in his world, but he was never interested. He considered this story only a fairy tale for children or some ancient legend. Now, however, the situation in which he found himself reminded him of the biblical duel between young David and Goliath that took place several thousand years ago. Faith, the boy said quietly to himself. Okay, he added, then looked up to look the giant straight in the face. After a while, he also looked at his gun. On the sword there was still polished gold inscription. Finally, David felt confident, all the more so because he was not threatened with death. His task was to simply knock down a giant who would not do anything to him, unless the giant starts wailing his big paws in a frenzy. David, however, no longer thought of failure. He took the sword in both hands by the great hilt and threw himself towards the great Selif. The boy jumped up and they will swing their sword. However, he had to remember not to accidentally kill the warrior but at most to injure or knock him down. David wasn't aggressive enough to take someone's life anyway. He just wasn't a murderer and wouldn't kill someone at a regular competition. While David was still flying in the air, the serious Selif simply grabbed the blade of the sword unexpectedly with his bare, thick and wiry hand. A good blade wounded the giant's hand, but he did not care at all and brutally jerked David. The boy thundered to the ground along with the gun. Selif was so tall that when he lifted David up and let him go, the boy fell from a few good meters. Fortunately, the ground was covered with sand everywhere, so David quickly recovered and got up as if nothing had happened. After a while, however, he realized that he had not picked up a sword from the ground. The boy hurried down to pick up his weapon. What is it? David shouted when he saw that the sword was not on the ground. Eventually, however, he saw it covered with sand. David again leaned down, but suddenly something knocked him off his feet. Selif apparently didn't want to wait, so he knocked the young man over with a soft kick. The giant burst out with a tubular laugh when he heard the boy scream, at least as if he had been knocked down by an elephant. In David's mind, doubts finally began to appear that he would lose. This time he heard another voice in his head. You won't win with him. You're just worthless garbage, a weak trash bullied at school. You have always been so weak, so no one loved you. Everyone abandoned you like a stupid dog and didn't want to take care of you in this battered world of yours. After a while, however, this good voice returned. Nope, this is not true. You are strong, you just haven't discovered it yet. The basis is faith. Believe in yourself and you will overcome that. What is the invincible? David was now confused. He wondered which voice was more right. If you give up, nothing big will happen. You will have peace of mind. You don't want to embark on this stupid, dangerous mission, shouted an evil voice. If you will give up, you will chicken out, then you will be weak. You are like that because you never thought that the soul of a true warrior was dormant in you. David no longer had any doubts about which vote to choose. He chose the voice that was encouraging and uplifting, not the one that humiliated and lied to him. So the boy got up and said to his opponent, "I choose the truth. I am no longer a weak subject." Selif, who did not really know what the boy meant, took on a comical expression on his face, but it did not last long. David threw himself again at the giant without a weapon in his hand. Selif was surprised for a moment by the surprise attack, so David gained a small advantage at the very beginning. The boy grabbed Selif tightly by the neck with his arms and kicked his legs in the stomach. The kick did not harm the armored body, but temporarily deprived the giant of balance. Selif roared, however, not out of pain but out of anger. The giant was about to knock the kid off his feet, but David had anticipated Selif's plans, so he pushed his feet away from his body, depriving him of balance again. David landed on the ground and pulled a dagger out of the small vagina in a flash. Then he took a few steps back because Selif started running towards him. When the angry giant was close, David hooked him with his leg. The boy felt unheard of pain when Selif's big body thundered in his leg, but it was worth it. The giants will fall to the ground splashing sand in all directions as if a firecracker hit the ground. David, of course, also fell over and could not get up in pain, but the opponent was next to him, so the boy again attacked the enemy. Selif turned out to be as fast as he was, so they would swing their fist at the boy, but it was too late. David struck the giant's head twice with the head of a dagger, inviting him to the land of sleep. Selif was blurred, or rather blurred everything around his eyes. Then you could see only darkness and hear a pleasant silence. The audience saw Selif lying unconscious on the ground, and David was concerned if he had accidentally split the giant's skull. The giant's mouth, however, was now adorned with a slight smile. The boy thought that his dream must be really pleasant, but he did not notice that Selif's face simply contorted when he fell face down to the ground. Selif, however, literally looked as if he was sleeping peacefully and dreaming of a beautiful dream. The angry giant in an instant turned into a docile sheep who could no longer hurt anyone. Slowly, louder and louder applause began to be heard. "Nice, David," shouted Nathan among the crowd, which, as it turned out, was more late than his companion. The Lord also clapped. It was true that for Hendron this duel was not impressive, but anyway David defeated the giant, so the young man deserved for applause. Lord has seen many excellent clashes of heroes and knights at tournaments. He himself was a powerful warrior and the king's most favorite subject, sowing admiration and fear in many lands. However, he clapped for the fact that for the first time he saw someone so young and halfling knock down Selif himself. If David had been an adult swordsman, the Lord's admiration would have been much less. Meanwhile, the young winner said he could probably leave. He picked up his sword and walked towards the exit of the square. Two men behind him took the large body of the unconscious Selif with effort and led him to the tent of Dr. Selmvoort. Suddenly, David heard a familiar voice behind him. "You are strong, the basis is faith. You believed in yourself and you won." The boy turned violently backwards and saw Nanthorin. After a while, he remembered a good voice that had recently spoken in his mind during a fight. David was suddenly terrified, and they twitched unexpectedly like jelly. He heard similar words in his head. Nanthorin was apparently reading his mind. The boy, out of surprise and fear, no longer twitched but freezed like a pole. He stopped moving completely and stared with a dull look at the warrior's face. After a while, however, they will shake off and reach out to give Nanthorin the sword he took away without permission. He noticed that the warrior had been looking at it from the very beginning. "The sword is your friend," replied the giant. David was very surprised, and this time he began to stare at the master's weapon. It was only after a long while that he said, "What? Like this? What are you going to fight with? Aren't you afraid to give your weapon to a guy like me?" He was surprised. "Believe me, this sword will be more useful to you than to me. Besides, I have a much more powerful weapon than a regular blade with me," the giant replied calmly. "What weapon? I guess you don't mean those forks hidden under the sleeve?" asked a curious David. "Show me it, PLS," said the boy. "I'd rather not show it," the giant replied. "Why?" The boy broke down. "Because everyone will see it," the giant replied calmly as always. "So what? Do you have some illegal weapons or what? The boy became interested. Nope. This weapon comes from another world. I have an order to not to show it to you pending there will be no time for that, Nanthornin replied in a whisper. When David heard this, he finally dared to ask. Nanthornin, WH, who are you actually? To clairvoyant hoarseness, what the hell, what do you think? The giant asked. Me? What? I don't know, I'm not understand anything here anymore. From the beginning I do not know what is happening here. These people here do not even know what a hazel is, although I began to doubt that all these people are people at all. Actually, I also do not know who the hazel is to the end, shouted the boy, no longer controlling himself. Calm down, David. I know that all this here is completely new to you, Nanthornin reassured the boy. David finally came to his senses and fell silent. I'll give you a tip, maybe then you will finally find out who I am, Nanthornin replied. Speak, give me this tip, said David toward himself. Okay, I'm already saying, calmly, so who did you ask for help after Max beat you in school? The boy was a little scared that Nanthornin knew about Max and the whole situation at his school. After a while, however, the boy realized that this giant has some supernatural powers. After all, it was Nanthornin who took him to this unknown world. The giant waited for David's reaction and response. So, I asked for help. A god, I already know, you are a wizard, the boy tried, but immediately he raped in the forehead. After all, it has nothing to do with this god, he said. Oh yes, now I really know. Nanthornin turned into hearing, you are Jesus. Yes, your appearance indicates this, long, dark hair, beard and tanned skin. Oh Holy Mother, could this be true? David blurted out, forgetting completely that Nanthornin was wearing battle armor. In addition, the boy modeled himself only on paintings depicting this figure in various churches in his world. Meanwhile, the giant, hearing the answer, will burst with laughter, or rather a muffled giggle. Of course, I'm not, though you're a pretty good combination, so, keep going, we'll see what you come up with. David only now realized that Jesus usually had even longer and lighter curly hair in the paintings. However, he did not take into account that no painting depicts an exact image of Christ. David began to feel stranger and stranger. Not only did he find himself in this strange world, but they also began to have a conversation about the Son of God himself, in whom David did not really believe, but he considered himself an ordinary Catholic, which was the majority of people in his country. Then answer who you are. An alien? Probably not. Tell me this secret because I can't understand it. What God has to do with this stupid theater? The boy finally said in a rude tone. I won't tell you, but I promise that you yourself should finally find out. The giant replied calmly as always. The boy, hearing this, broke down so much that he kicked the stone next to him in anger and immediately regretted it because of the pain. In addition, he did it with his right sole leg, which he had previously knocked down by Selith. We will go to the tent. I'll see what's with your leg, boy, Nanthornin replied. The giant grabbed David under his arm and walked with him towards his little shelter. Chapter 11. David opened his eyes. It was just a beautiful morning. The boy did not have a watch, but to the eye it looked like it was about 8 o'clock. The young man patted his bandaged, stiffened leg. Fortunately, nothing serious happened to him, that just at rest. David will close his eyes again. He decided that he had nothing to do, so he decided to continue resting under a warm duvet. The boy began to think about various things. He stated that he was only in this world on the 5th day and felt like in paradise again despite us all in. There was no school and no wild screams of students. There was only silence, peace and beautiful nature all around. However, the silence was suddenly broken after a while, because a hard, male voice would shout outside. Shut up, you Hazel. David, hearing this, thought at first that something had overheard him, but after a while he heard a second scream. You yourself are Hazel. David realized that he had not been mishearing. He got up without haste and walked carefully out of the tent, trying to save his leg as much as he could. In a few moments, he searched for two men shouting at each other, calling each other of Hazels. Apparently, unfortunately, the Dr. Selnavat had already told others about this unknown word. David thought heartbroken, not knowing what to think about all this. I have to talk to this Selnavat, the boy said aloud. After these words, he slowly walked towards the tent clinic as David called the tent of the old doctor. On the way, he saw more people yelling at each other. You have a skin color similar to Hazel. Ha, 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 mocked himself first. Be silent, you Hazel, shouted the other with a clearer indignation and unpleasant horror in his eyes. David, who saw this, could no longer stand it. What did I do? The boy yelled in distraught, seeing more and more conflicted people. He felt sorry that so many people, instead of laughing with each other and talking normally as always, now insult each other, and it was because of him. David had the impression that everyone in the camp was already being called Hazel. Finally, after a while, the boy found himself in front of the tent of Dr. Selnvoet. They pulled the curtain apart, or rather jerked violently, and he went inside. In the middle of the room, at his desk, sat old Selnvoet, who looked up at the guest entering. "Ah, that's you, boy. Can I help you?" the doctor said friendly to David. "Good morning," the boy growled rudely. "Oh, I see that something has happened to your leg youthfully," the doctor noted, not paying attention to David's rude greeting. "Can I watch it? Surely it must have hurt?" the doctor asked carefully. "Nope. You don't have to," David replied nervously. This time, Selnvoet noticed that the boy was visibly enraged by something and had no intention of being polite to him. "Something happened?" the old man asked him again. "Yes. Too much has happened. That what has happened is that everyone is called each other by Hazels. If you haven't noticed it, it's definitely your fault," the boy shouts. The old man was surprised and a little angry with this unpleasant greeting and unfounded accusations. "It's not my doing. It's not my fault, boy," the doctor replied calmly. "In that case, who has spread that word to everyone? Dwarfs. I wouldn't be surprised, because in this world it's probably possible," David said maliciously, without showing even the slightest respect for an older, helpful person. "Please, calm down, boy," the doctor replied, adding after a while. "It was Metcalf who told others about this strange word. Look, he is lying here on the bed." Selnvoet pointed to one of the beds arranged in a row. In an instant, David calmed down and turned his gaze in that direction. On the bed lay a lonely figure covered with a duvet, with his back to him. "Metcalf, what happened?" The boy was surprised and went to the bed where the warrior was lying. Metcalf suddenly turned around abruptly, throwing off his quilt. David jumped up in terror when he saw the soldier's face. However, he regretted it because the jump caused even more pain in his right leg. After a while, however, he no longer paid attention to it, because he was now looking at Metcalf's swollen and bruised face. David had to take in a few breaths of fresh air to calm down. "What happened to you?" screamed terrified boy. "This psychopath Serema beat me up just for having fun of him. I just called him a Hazel," the poor man coughed up. "Did he beat you? It looks like your face is being trampled by a herd of bulls." After a while David broke down and became angry so that he began to tremble all over, and after a while he shouted again. "What did I do? I'm a moron." "And what is a moron?" Metcalf became interested, whose humor immediately returned. "I will not tell you, because it will end in another disaster," David replied, and then added after a while, "And how did you even know about this cursed word?" "I overheard your conversation with Selnvoet yesterday," Metcalf replied quietly. "And you told others about this word, about Hazel?" David asked, and after a while he realized that the question sounded as if he had just challenged Metcalf from a Hazel. Fortunately, the warrior did not pay attention to this and answered the boy's question briefly. "Yes." "Why did you do it?" "Now there is a total disaster in the camp." David broke down, banging on his forehead, in a frenzy. "I didn't know what the word meant, so I thought that others would be able to know its meaning," the warrior justified himself. "But for what? Why? How? There is a real nightmare in the camp. Some horror," the boy lamented. Selnvoet began to listen more attentively to the strange and loud conversation with a clear curiosity. "How was I supposed to know that this is how it would end?" Metcalf finally replied to the boy's question. "Okay. I'll give you peace of mind. I hope that this nightmare will finally end soon and everyone will forget about this psychographic word," David replied. "And what is psychographic?" asked the warrior. "I don't know. I don't want to know. I will not say." "Never!" David's screams, so loud that he choked. Selnvoet approached him and, with an open hand, began to pat the young man firmly on the back to help him. "Thank you," the boy said in a weak and whimsical voice, and then turned to leave. When he did this, he saw that there were people standing there, who apparently were eavesdropping on everything and watching, and ran away when the boy looked in their direction. Great, David cried out, pretending to be very happy about this fact, and then he came out of the tent. Chaos continued in the whole camp. Why did all these people like and love this pathetic word so much? David wondered aloud, seeing every now and then the unpleasant sight of people who were becoming afraid of themselves. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a man who turned to him. "You have skin of the color of real hazelman, did you know that?" David wrapped himself in the forehead, and he replied. "Embrace yourself, guy. I think you've eaten too much of that damned hazel if you're talking such nonsense." After a while, the boy decided to act and he screamed at the bottom of his lungs so that everyone around him could hear him. "Embrace each other at last, people." Everyone, despite the bustle, turned towards the boy. Someone's voice spoke from the crowd. "Oh, we apologize for disturbing David. We will try to laugh and joke more quietly." David recognized that the voice belonged to Sirma. This scout was slowly began to irritate David, though he didn't know him very well. This man beat Metcalf only for calling him a hazel, and now he probably uses this cursed word and encourages others to do so, treating it like some funny innocent joke. The boy was even more sad that he insulted Celian and said that he could not do anything when he himself behaved worse than a little child. David was the first time he had encountered something like this. The great warriors who surrounded him inspired respect, admiration and role model in him, and Sirma now behaved as if he was not an adult at all. There was silence for a long time, but when David finally turned and walked further toward his tent, he heard the screams and laughter of the people behind him. The boy realized that this day, however, would not be one of the best. He broke down even more when he remembered that it was all his fault. "I promised to myself never to use that useless word again," the boy said to himself as he entered his tent. David was lying in a tent not knowing what to do with himself. He was bored mercilessly and even worse. The boy out of boredom was playing with his dagger. After a while, he began to rummage aimlessly in his jeans pocket until he suddenly sensed an object in it. When he groped the thing, he guessed that it must be some kind of piece of paper. David pulled out something and saw his school lesson plan that he was putting in his pants in his world to have it always at hand. The lesson plan was drawn by him by hand and he decorated it himself, but he forgot about it completely. They will look at him to see what lessons he had. After a while, the boy came up with a brilliant idea to get rid of nightmarish boredom and glued together a makeshift paper plane from this piece of paper. When David finished, he threw his plane. Object flew up for a while and then fell down. "Ouch!" David shouted after a while, because suddenly the paperwork hit his face with a sharpened tip. "I always make crap paper planes that can't fly straight for a moment." He got angry and waved the plane with nerves, throwing it. When he did it, he decided that it was no longer worth getting angry because literally a few seconds after the first hit he got a second time in the face. He lay down again, but suddenly a person fell into the tent whose face could not be seen by the rays of the sun falling inside. The figure turned towards him and said, "What are you doing, David? Come with me, Lord Hendron will fight. You have to see it." David recognized Turhin's young voice. The boy got up without haste. He didn't know why he hadn't come up with this great idea and go outside to get rid of this boredom. The boy decided that watching someone's fight is certainly much better than constantly lazing in a whiz. Besides, he wanted to see with his own eyes how Hendron handled a gun in his hand, so they would stretch out and follow the boy slowly. Turhin led David behind the Lord's great tent to a place they both knew well. A huge crowd of spectators gathered around the barracks. When David broke through the layer of people, he found a tree trunk cut down by the railing, so he sat on it. The large trunk was so huge for the boy that you sat on it like on a comfortable chair. After a while, David spotted the rest of his friends on the left. Dago noticed the boy so he started waving at him. However, it looked quite strange because Muddy will not even smile at this greeting. David also roared barely visibly at his skinny friend, but immediately afterwards he turned his eyes to the square because there was some kind of commotion there. After a while, the boy found out what was going on because he had just seen Lord jumping over the fence to the exercise area. This surprised David a little, for he thought that the great Lord should have walked through the gate like a noble one. Meanwhile, Hendron simply jumped over the fence like an agile cat and pulled the sword out of the scabbard with a quick and even unnaturally lightning-fast movement of his hand. David, however, stopped looking at the Lord after a while because he saw another person on the right. This person, however, did not resemble a slim, agile Hendron at all. He was a powerful warrior with incredibly wide bars and narrow hips. His face was covered by a large silver helmet with a thick visor. In his hands the giant held a sword about 1.5 meters long. David was impressed by the hiccups, but the Lord standing in front of the iron colossus did not show even the slightest expression of horror. In his eyes you could see great self-confidence. However, it was not an expression of self-aggrandizement or self-righteousness. In the depths of his eyes, you could just see self-confidence. Suddenly, after a while, a loud voice came from the crowd. "Our noble, powerful lord will be fight against Gelwood, the one of the best and most honorable knights of Astria." After these words sounded from loud cheers gathered, immediately afterwards, when the crowd fell silent, a person sitting on top of a small wooden turret signaled with his hand that the fight was already beginning. The mighty Gelwood drew a second sword from behind his back that David had not seen before. Both weapons had purple handles and all the rest were silver without unnecessary ornaments. The boy pointed out that purple must probably be the national color of Astria, just like orange here. After these thoughts, David suddenly realized that he did not even know the name of the land in which he had been for 6 days. Reflecting, not knowing what to think about this funny coincidence, he suddenly twitched like a lightning bolt, or maybe even something worse, because Gelwood suddenly roared like a wild beast and rushed towards Hendron. David, who fell to the ground out of impression and fear, could no longer get up through his stiffened leg. Meanwhile, the Astrian was already halfway from Hendron. Lord, however, was not afraid. David, on the other side, twitched all the time, for the worried is that the earth is shaking through the square. In fact, the boy was twitching just for this reason, because he was wondering that a real earthquake was about to appear. Lord still did nothing but waving and playing with weapon in his hand. "Oh, he will perish. Lord will perish. He will be trampling him. Save the ruler." David howled like a puppy, seeing an Astrian who was almost half the size more than Selif himself. Or so the boy thought like that. The crowd, however, looked at it all as fun, and did not even hear the thin voice squeaking with David's fear. After all, the giant was already a few meters from the target. Only then did Hendron react. The Lord jumped, grabbed the Astrian's big helmet and jumped over the 4-meter warrior. David couldn't imagine it. The Lord twisted, or more precisely turned in the air around the giant's neck, and with a strong kick deprived him of balance. The young man who saw this was surprised. Was Hendron using his own tactics, or maybe he invented it himself a long time ago? Gelwood, surpassing the average people in this world by almost a meter, turned out to be surprisingly for the agile Lord the weak point of the giant. Hendron stood on his shoulders without any problems, jumped and knocked down a giant who was difficult to regain his balance. For such a mutant who, in addition, was covered with armor, it was an incredibly difficult feat. After a while, he fell clumsily to the ground with great thunder. The dust rose up, and when he disappeared after a while, Hendron landed on his back. Gelwood grunted loudly in pain as the armor under Lord's weight began to crush his spine. David couldn't believe his eyes. The whole fight lasted only a few seconds. For the boy, however, all these emotions made the look much longer. Spectators went crazy with triumphant shouts and applause. After a while, the Lord finally came down from the back of the defeated and raised his hand to help the knight get up. Gelwood disagreed, not because he was furious with the Lord, but because he knew that Hendron would not be able to help him anyway. Fortunately, after a while, the warrior grabbed the railing and managed to get up quite neatly. He staggered again, but his 2 low-level squires were already on appeal. "Who wants to volunteer as second to fight our invincible, undefeated Lord?" suddenly said a man sitting on a small tower. There was silence. Apparently no one has the courage, David thought, until suddenly he heard a strangely familiar voice coming from the crowd. I mean, no, or rather, yes, I want to fight." This familiar voice turned out to belong to Poppin. David saw his short friend jumping over the fence. After a while, he was already standing in front of Hendron and saluting to him. To David it looked quite ridiculous, because Poppin looked like a small child next to the Lord. He preferred not to imagine what he would look like next to Gelwood. The whole crowd fell silent. From time to time, all you could hear was a quiet giggle. Poppin, do you have any experience about combat or weapons at all? You're a cook. No one has trained you to be a swordsman so far, Hendron finally said to the halfling. "I have already dealt with weapons. My task now is to train combat. Even before we won the Lord's competition, it is right time to confess to you, Lord, that I was once on a long journey. and there I learned to fight. I can still confess that, on this expedition I just lost my hand if you were ever interested in it, Pupin said, barely saying every word. The Lord nodded his head in surprise as a sign that he understood, and after a while he spoke again. And that's interesting. I don't think you ever told me about it, Pupin. I thought you've always been an ordinary cook and now you're telling me about some kind of expedition, a fight, and I don't know what else. People who were closest to the interlocutors clearly listened to this unusual conversation. I decided that there was no need to tell you all this, my friend. I just wanted to live peacefully and forget about who I was. I just didn't want anyone to bother me with questions, but as you can see I can't hold my tongue for so long, the cook replied, and then there was a longer silence. However, the silence was broken by Hendron. Interesting. So maybe we'll finally start. The one who is stronger will win. The man on the turret nods his head as a sign that the fight may have already begun. Pupin suddenly pulled out his white, curved sword from behind the cape. Hendron had his eyes clear. He saw this weapon for the first time. In fact, until then, he did not even think that his own cook could have any sword, and in addition so powerful. As long as his eyes did not confuse him, the blade could have been made of the so-called moon crystal, a legendary stone from the Valley of Eternal Night in Antheria. The Lord, looking at this weapon, muttered something incomprehensible under his breath, not believing, and after a while he finally moved towards the new opponent. David watched it all, waiting to see what was about to happen, and with him the whole congregation. They even started to assume who would win. The large majority, of course, counted on the success of the Lord. However, when the players were already a few meters apart, something that was least expected happened. Pupin jumped so high that he reached the head of the tall Lord. He grabbed it and literally smacked it with the head of the sword in the chin. The cook in an instant turned into a brutal opponent. Then the audience saw something that was hard to explain. This is because the Lord fell to the ground after a while, overpowered by a dwarf who reached at most to his waist. Pupin got up from Lord's body so he could get up, but Hendron was still lying on the ground and said in a whimsical voice, "Now I don't have to worry about sending an ordinary cook on a mission, Pupin, because you are not, as you can see, only cook. You are also a good wrestler. What a extra." Pupin won. Wow, wow, wow. David suddenly began to scream in the crowd. "Stop barking like a dog, you little," because if you'll hear a growl. A man got angry about David, who was clearly in a very bad mood because he had just lost the bet and gave his last pennies to others. Chapter 12. The boy was walking around the vast camp. His leg was already quite well, so he allowed himself for a slow running. David simply wanted to explore the area around him and see for himself the greatness of the eternal camp. David learned the name of the encampment only after the Lord's duel with Pupin from Nanthonin. 2 days had passed since then, and people were still talking about this unusual, ridiculous fight between Hendron and his own cook. Fortunately, probably no one talks about Hazel anymore, the boy thought with relief. He was going to visit Metcal's tent on the way because the warrior managed to recover very quickly from the recent thud of Serema. Metcal had already returned from Selnovit's tent to his shelter. David continued on admiring the pretty white tents and the huge, colorful trees in the distance. After a while, he turned into a narrow street and saw 4 people next to one of the tents. He was very happy to recognize Netlin, Nanthonin, Turgene, and Metcal. All of them except the fair-haired heroist were the ones he was looking for. "What's up?" said the teenager. All 4 of them stopped the conversation and turned towards the boy. Nathan apparently did not fully understand the greeting because he took on a curious expression on his face, but after a while he guessed what was going on. "Good morning," replied the Lord's servant at last. The other 3 also said hello. "What are you doing?" asked David. "We are talking about this mission, for example," Metcal replied. David saw that he had a crooked nose. Previously, he noticed only the remnants of swelling, and now he noticed clearly that the warrior's nose was quite shifted to the side. "How he bullied you. You must have a broken nose," David wrote. "To tell the truth, I deserved it," Metcal replied. "How's that? After all, Serema is guilty and he deserved to be beat. When I was little and lived with my father in Hedron Castle, I teased Serema myself, David. We were eternal enemies. Now that he is stronger, he apparently planned to take revenge on me." "And why were you so mean to each other?" the boy asked. "I don't know. Rather, it started with the fact that Serema had always dreamed of becoming a scout and I mocked it and laughed at him. Then more and more frequent fights began. I always won, but Serema was never afraid for his teeth. Now I always lose. David nodded his head as a sign that he understood everything. It is worth to adding that once Serema was calm, I was the one who made him so furious. Besides, our families have been antagonized for generations. I don't know if that's true, but apparently my great-great-grandfather set fire to the house of Serema's family just for the fact that they stole his horse as a joke. Metcalf finished after a while. It's really very interesting, David replied, not knowing what to think about it all. Try to reconcile and make it up with Serema Metcalf. Nathan suddenly joined the conversation. I wanted to do it, but every time I want to tell him something, he starts beating me right away. Sometimes the belt in his hand can be a more naturous weapon than a bow, the warrior replied to Nathan. After a while there was a longer silence, but she was interrupted by someone's happy scream. Hey! People, Raven Murtagh is coming, come all of you in front of the Lord's tent. Hearing this, Nathan was visibly pleased. But who is this Raven Murtagh? David asked. Don't you know? He is a sage from the north, a teacher who comes with his school and travels to many lands to teach and help people, Nathan replied. When David heard this, he was immediately reminded of his school, Max, and mathematical torture. The boy flinched. Something wrong? What is going on? Metcalf asked. No, nothing. I just don't like school, the boy replied. But how can't you like Master Raven's school? Surprised Nathan. Let's go. I don't want to be late, the young man added. After a while, all five of them moved towards the main tent. Along the way, David wondered what the great sage from the north might look like. He imagined him as an old, noble and dignified nobleman of unheard of wisdom and wealth. However, the boy stopped thinking about it because he was just with friends in front of Hendron's tent. He lined up and awaited the arrival of the great sage with the others. Right next to him, Puppin found a place and behind him stood all the rest of his friends. You will see, my friend, how dignified he is, said the halfling with a half voice to the young man. Finally, when all the residents of the camp lined up, nice music sounded from afar, as if someone in the distance was playing drums and flutes. The music was getting louder and louder. After a while, David saw drummers and flutists entering the camp's clearing, who played their jumpy melody on instruments. They were followed by beautiful dancers who had in their hands golden dishes full of fruits, vegetables and bread. They wore colorful wreaths on their heads. They all had white dresses and on neat feet they wore sandals or slippers. On the sides, even armed men marched holding orange flags with emeralds painted in the middle. The orange background was additionally surrounded by a golden frame. It was for sure a coat of arms belonging to this land. David, however, did not pay attention to these order flags. Wow, this guy must be really great if he even has his subjects and soldiers, he thought. The boy could not wait to finally see the powerful sage. Suddenly, in the middle of the procession, he saw a wooden cart led by two donkeys that made only loud noises. After a while, he also noticed that a person was sitting in the cart on a pile of hay and pillows. He was an old man with a long, grey beard. He wore a hat with a white feather on his head and the clothes resembled to the suit of a typical monk. In his hand he held a long cane with a bulging tip. I wonder who it is. The boy wondered. Probably some peasant with goods of food, he said after a moment of reflection. The procession finally stopped in the middle of the clearing next to the great hearth. Our great teacher has arrived, Raven Murtagh of Narkecha, said a loud voice. David heard this and was surprised because he had never seen the great sage anywhere, or so he thought, because the old man in the hat had just come out of the wagon and said, "Hello my dears." At that voice, the whole crowd shouted like one man. "Welcome Raven." David, seeing and hearing all this, didn't understand any of this. "You told me Poppin that he is dignified and now I see a peasant," David said quietly to the halfling. "Do you think that dignity is only about appearance? Oh no, this man has a dignified heart, not an appearance. Besides, I advise you not to insult my friend," replied Poppin. "Are you telling me that this guy is a good friend of yours?" David was surprised. "Yes, he accompanied me on the expedition I have already told you about," Poppin replied calmly. After a while, Hendron came out of the tent and behind him two other people who were carrying his wooden, large chair. "Greetings to the great lord," Raven greeted the lord with a slight bow. "Hello, what do you have to tell us this year?" Hendron asked the newcomer. "Various things, whatever you want, lord. I can tell you a story," The Lord sat down in a chair and replied, "Good. I will gladly listen to some admonition from the sage. In these difficult times, we will definitely need someone people like you." When two interlocutors interrupted the conversation, everyone sat on the soft grass and Rabban Murtagh began. "At first, I will treat you all with some food. Apples from my orchard will surely appeal to you the most." After these words, the girls with wreaths on their heads began to distribute food to the gathered. When one of them approached David, he felt like a small child fed by his mother. All of these young women were also tall as well as men. David tried a fruit similar in appearance to an apple. Maybe even it was an apple so much that in this world it was much bigger. So he tasted them to see if this was really the case. The juicy taste melted in the mouth. The boy in an instant fell into one of the new addictions. He wanted to shout to the woman who was moving away, "Give more," but he refrained. Besides, no one would agree to his whims for sure. After all, there might not be enough food for everyone. David, however, with great difficulty refrained from throwing himself like an animal on a bowl of fruit. "This food is heavenly," he thought. He had never eaten such delicious fruit. Finally, after a long time, the food was finished giving away. The boy noticed that one of the women had a few more fruits in her basket. His saliva ran out and he licked his lips involuntarily. He wanted to get the other 2 or 3 apples that remained. David thought that maybe when he politely asked, they would agree and give him at least one fruit. "After all, food can't be wasted," he said. After a while, he came up with an idea. He pulled out of his pocket his creased paper plane. He wanted to write something on it, but after a while he realized that he had nothing to write. Angry, he threw the plane unintentionally towards Rabban's vehicle. Everyone suddenly saw a white object flying in the air. "Oh!" Everyone got the sound of interest out of themselves. Rabban Murtagh also saw this thing flying straight in his direction. To David's amazement, the sage cried out in horror when he saw an ordinary plane of paper and jumped aside. The plane crashed into a haystack in a coach just above the old man's head. The sage opened his frightened eyes and saw what had frightened him so much. "What is that?" he asked himself. He pulled out the crashed plane and groped it. "It's paper," he said aloud. "Who did it? Who invented it?" asked Rabban. No one answered. "This is brilliant. I don't know how I could never have come up with such a simple invention before," replied the teacher looking closely at the find. "I did it," a young and uncertain voice suddenly mumbled. Everyone turned in that direction. Rabban Murtagh finally saw the young man after a while. "You?" he asked, astonished. Why, yes," the boy stuttered quietly. "What is your name, boy?" "David," the young man replied briefly. "So, David, what is the name of your excellent invention for scaring people?" David thought for a moment that the sage was joking about him, but after a while he realized something else. After all, he was in a medieval similar world. "This is a paper airplane," he finally replied as calmly as he could. "Airplane? And what is the airplane?" asked Rabban again curiously. "Airplane? Such a thing that, it just flies," the embarrassed boy replied. "So, a paper bird?" David was clogged for a moment. He didn't know what to answer. "Yes, something like that, I think." "The bird," he finally said. The sage nodded and after a while replied. "So you have created an invention that can serve us well, boy. These paper birds can be used instead of racing pigeons. It's amazing. For the last few years I have been trying to create a flying model of a bird, but it never occurred to me that it could be done in such a simple way." "That's great. We scouts send each other a lot of messages. Such paper birds will be useful to us. Our country will earn tons of gold by selling plain folded paper." "Yes," shouted a voice from the crowd suddenly. David recognized Serenma's overjoyed voice, which he already knew well. The boy didn't know what to do. But this thing does not have a large range. It's just paper." He began to scream, but no one listened to him because everyone was just staring at a new invention. "It's not suitable," cried David again. This time, attention was paid to him and everyone began to look at the boy with an insatiable look. "Then we have to try this new discovery," said the sage. The whole crowd agreed with the teacher with nods and nods. "Thank you, David. Thanks to you, we will not have to send pigeons with messages, but only birds from paper. Thanks to your find, we will be famous all over the world. We will make a big fortune," Serema shouted to David from afar. The boy grabbed his head. He no longer understood what was going on around him. He managed to let out only a prolonged helpless waif. People chased happily in different directions as if they had discovered something the most amazing in the world, literally as if the boy had just created the eighth wonder of the world. A moment ago, everyone was sitting quietly on the grass. "Let's let our bird out of the observation tower, come and see it, folks," Rayburn shouted. After these words, whole crowds rushed towards Mount Nathara. When David opened his eyes, heartbroken, he realized that he was the only one already in the clearing. He looked north and saw a crowd of people moving away. Rayburn ran like crazy for his years, waving an airplane in his hand. After a while, the boy decided to run after them. He had nothing to do in the camp. These people are clumsy, unreasonable. They leave the camp without guards. What if someone robs the camp? After all, no one is here, the boy noticed when he was about to start running. "Don't worry, David, I'm on guard here. Besides, in Effinestion one rarely sees looters," a familiar voice suddenly said. David turned and saw Nanthonin. "And what is Effinestia?" "That's the name of this country," David guessed, amused by the fact that he had just discovered it. "Yes, we are located in Effinestia. That is the name of this small land," the giant replied. David quietly repeated the name of the country several times. Only now will he know exactly where he is. "Go now, David," the Nanthonin suddenly said to the boy. David obediently turned without any word and ran after the trail of the raging crowd. When he was at the end of the camp, he saw again from a distance a crowd of people who were just entering the forest. When he got there, of course, no one was there. In front of it was only a stone wall. After a while, however, David remembered the mysterious stairs to the top with which the inhabitants of the camp had made their way. He turned right into the dense forest. After about 5 minutes, the boy found what he was looking for. The large, wide staircase with high steps was not adapted to the size of David and especially to people like Poppin, but they were certainly a better entrance than a stone wall. David began to climb the steps 20 meters up. When he finished, his legs hurt so much that he had to rest for a while. He sat down on one of the stones and turned his gaze to the west. In the distance you could see people slowly disappearing. The boy got up after a few seconds and rushed in that direction. Unfortunately, many boulders did not allow him to run freely, so David had to run to the others by slalom. However, it was not easy because the boy had the impression that they were running much faster, so he ran like crazy and it was not visible that he was approaching them. After 30 minutes of running, David no longer had the strength. In his world, he would get tired much faster anyway. Fortunately, after a while the boy saw a huge tower with a pointed roof. Around her you could see the crowd gathered from afar. David breathed a moment and then allowed himself to run for a while to get there faster. When the boy approached, he noticed Rayburn, who was entering the tower through a small wooden door. "Come in, David. You are, after all, the creator of this invention, isn't it?" cried the sage from a small window on the first floor. The boy obediently entered the tower through a door that turned out to be the perfect size for him. When he was inside, he saw a winding, steep staircase leading upstairs. David began another climb up the stairs, this time 25 meters up. When the boy was already on the 5th floor, he looked through a small window. He saw through them a great forest and behind it mountains, where the gate of the 3 worlds should be. "I wonder what this 3rd world is," David thought aloud. His thoughts were interrupted by Rayburn's voice coming from above. "Faster, David, we can't wait." So the boy climbed another batch of stairs. After a while, it was already at the very top of the tower. A gusty wind suddenly struck his face. David approached the railing where Rayburn, Murtag, Nethin, Puppin, Turhin, Serima, Cordrin, Turgin and Hendron stood with several armed men. The sage bent over the wooden railing and shouted to the crowd downstairs. "Today, for the first time in the history of Effinestion, all of you will see the best invention of the year I have ever seen. I present you a paper bird, a bird that is not an animal but a wonderful flying card." After these words, he took the momentum and threw a paper plane towards the south where the Eternal Camp was located. The plane flew quickly, rushed by the wind. David did not know that his work could fly so smoothly. At the bottom there were voices of excited people. "It's something flies like a real bird," said a man when he saw a white flying point in the air. Rayburn looked at the plane moving away quickly, and when it disappeared from sight, he said to David standing next to him, "That's amazing. An ordinary folded sheet of paper can fly with the help of the wind like the truest bird. It soars all the time and with only one panache." David, hearing this, twisted his eyes invisibly. He wasn't that excited because he knew that his very amazing invention was certainly not as good as an intelligent bird. "That's fantastic," said Lord after a moment, leaning dangerously behind the barrier. Nathan, being his servant, had to approach him so that nothing bad would happen. Hendron, however, was still an airplane which was no longer visible. Serema, however, was clearly the most impressed, because he said after a while, "That's wonderful, it's beautiful, it's amazing. David, tell me how this paper miracle is made, you are genius." After these words, he pulled out of the bag at the waist some paper folded into a roll. "This is an unnecessary document about my noble person. Please make it a paper bird for me. I want to see how it's done." The boy twisted his eyes again with snort, but listened to the pleas of a strange scout. So David snatched the roll from Serema's hand, he unfolded it, and quickly began to assemble a model of the plane. The scout looked closely at each detail, unconsciously bringing his face was closer and closer to the sheet of paper. When the young man finished his work, Serema looked even closer to get a better look at the invention. His eyes were now like the eyes of a little child who had just discovered something of the most amazing. "That's great. How easy it is. Thank you, David. Thanks to you, I will be famous," he shouted after a while, and then did something really idiotic. He kissed the boy twice on the cheeks like a little son. When he finally finished, the youngster whipped his shy cheeks in disgust, and Nathan looked at him with sincere compassion. Serema was jumping from joy, laughing at the sky. David was not so laughable. He did not like the last words of the master of the bow. The boy had thrown the plane with anger just under the scout's feet and began to go down the stairs. "I'll call you a paper cuckoo bird." David heard Serema's voice behind him after a while and stopped when he had already gone down a few steps. The boy realized that the scout had just named his new, or rather the first bird from paper,